Welcome to the Tamiki Ergonomics podcast. I'm Matt Jeffs. In this episode, we return to speak with Professor Emeritus in Human-Centered Design at Cornell University, Dr. Alan Hedge. In what follows, Dr. Hedge explains that ergonomic interventions align posture, fatigue awareness, and productivity for a healthier and happier workplace. Remember to click on the notification bell to keep up with the best ergonomics knowledge sharing, and feel free to leave a comment below. Also, be sure to subscribe and share this and future episodes with colleagues and clients who can benefit from this valuable information. Now, join us as we listen and learn from a pioneer and statesman in the field of ergonomics, Dr. Alan Hedge. Welcome back to Tamiki Ergonomics Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Jeffs, and once again, we have Dr. Alan Hedge. He's going to share with us topics today, including posture and fatigue and productivity and ergonomics, all kind of in one. Welcome back, Alan. How are you?
Thanks very much, Matt. I'm very well indeed.
It's good to have you back. We enjoyed the first two discussions, and we wanted to delve a little deeper into these topics of, well, productivity on a larger scale. But as we deep dive, we realize there's a lot of connecting dots, including posture and fatigue. And so we recognize that posture can be a risk for injury and lead to inefficiency as well. We also recognize that fatigue is upstream from discomfort, which is upstream from pain, which is upstream from lost time disability. So fatigue is something very valuable to cue in on as well. Can you share with us a little bit of some of the current knowledge in terms of maintaining a steady, consistent output while kind of keeping that extra eye on things like fatigue?
Absolutely, Matt. The first thing to realize is there is no way on earth that a human being can maintain a steady output. A robot maybe can do that, right. But by definition, we're fatigue machines. If you think about it, we have natural hormonal cycles that affect our level of performance throughout the day. We tend to sleep at night when it's dark. So if you're actually working on a night shift in a factory, you're already in a suboptimal physiological state to do that work. And even within the daytime, there are different times of day at which different aspects of our behavior are optimized. So, for example, if you want to look at when are people most alert, if you measure alertness, that typically is kind of late morning, around 11 a.m. Right? If you want to look at when are people best coordinated to do fine motor tasks, that's not when they're most alert. That's actually sort of early afternoon or 2:30ish in the afternoon if we're on a 24-hour day.
Right.
If you then say, yeah, but I'm not just interested in that, I want to know when they can do things the fastest. What's their fastest reaction times? Well, you got to shift the clock again, because your fastest reaction time is usually around 4:30 or, well, maybe 5:30, depending what time zone you're on. And then when you look in the evening, that's when you've got, your higher levels of blood pressure. And a lot of studies show that people's blood pressure is not just being at work that elevates it, but it elevates after you've left work and you've commuted home or whatever. So the first thing to overcome is the idea that we are sort of biological robots. We're not. Our performance varies throughout the day. It's pretty easy to demonstrate that if I just ask you to do the same task repeatedly. So if I ask you to write your name 10 times first thing in the morning, 10 times at lunchtime, 10 times at the end of the workday, they will not be the same. A robot will perfectly reproduce that, but that's not true there. And so a couple of things are going on here. One is that we have to look at what is the task that somebody is doing and how does that match to their physiological processes and their time of day. right? It's no accident that when you look at industrial accidents, I mean, you look at something like Chernobyl or something like 3 Mile Island, almost always these major incidents and accidents occur in the early hours of the morning. Why is that? Well, even though you're on the night shift, in the early hours of the morning, your cognitive performance level is pretty poor compared to the optimal level later in the day, right? So you really have to sort of match the tasks to the work people are doing. Now, we generically call that fatigue, but of course there are different kinds of fatigue. There's mental fatigue, so you can get really tired of something. Now, you can either get tired of it because, wow, this is incredibly boring, right? So your job is to put one widget against another widget all day long. You zone out, you're really bored. You can get mentally fatigued because people are firing questions at you and you haven't got time to process it and get the answer out. You can be mentally fatigued by high levels of stress, like trying to do something, trying to get a good thought together when you're in an open plan office and there's lots of noise and disturbances around you. So there are many aspects that will influence that kind of performance. And then there's physical fatigue. Now, we think of work primarily as a combination of physical and mental. I'm going to focus on physical for much of the time here, but we'll get back to some mental issues later. In terms of physical work, we think, the bigger, the stronger you are, the more you're able to do physical work. Well, kind of, but not always, because it depends what that work really is, how quickly you have to do it, how often you have to do it. Most of the listeners here will never have seen a little clip of a comedian called Lucille Ball trying to deal with chocolates coming down a conveyor belt and increasing speed, right? You have to optimize. You've got to optimize the cycle time of the work that you're doing. But not only that, you have to think of what is doing the work. So we physically do work by moving limbs in space. Moving those limbs requires the activity of muscles that are going to be pulling on little guide ropes called tendons. And it requires also that those tendons at some point attach to stronger tissues called bones. And that lets us make movements and do things. So you can do that once, and boy, that's great. So if I say lift this relatively heavy object, you can do it. If I now say lift this relatively heavy object 300 times, you're not going to make it there, right?
That's right.
Because for every effort, you require a recovery period. And so the pace of work, as well as the magnitude of work in terms of the loads that you're dealing with, have to be optimized to what the body can actually handle. And that's not fixed. So if you start off as you're 100 pounds weakling and you go to a gym and all you can lift is 20 pounds, a year later you might be 120 pounds less of a weakling and now you could lift 30 pounds, right? Muscles and bone tend to strengthen with the forces that are applied to them within limits. This is a big problem for astronauts because being in zero gravity, you lose muscle mass really quickly, in the order of a couple of weeks, and you lose bone density as well. So the thought that you're going to send anybody to Mars, there'll be a lump of jello by the time they get there unless we figure this out. So people repeating activities can get stronger, and that means that you can do maybe work a little faster and also maybe deal with higher loads. But there's another aspect to this as well, and that is the technique, right? So imagine that, think of ergonomics as being coaching, that you're coaching an athlete. Now, let's say a tennis player. You may think that tennis is all about who can hit the ball hardest. But if that's all you do, you'll hit the ball out of the court every time. Because the force you can generate on the racket head is much greater than the force you need to actually get the ball to stay into the court. So you have to learn technique. And technique is really critical as well, right? Technique invariably means that you're not just dealing with strength, you're dealing with posture. How you do something tends to not be focused on how strongly or how much force can you apply, but how effectively can you apply that force. So if you're hitting a tennis ball, if you hit it with a flat racket head, it's going to fly out the court. You have to learn to hit it so you put spin on the ball to keep it in the court. And so if you think of sports coaching, I mean, if all you had to do was build muscle mass, the best athlete would be the Hulk, right?
Right.
But that's not the case. And look at that. Marathon runners, for example, usually are not hugely muscular individuals. Weightlifters, on the other hand, usually are. But they're not very good at running marathons and vice versa. So you really have to look at all of these factors and then relate that back to how do you optimize the work so that you minimize fatigue, maximize performance, and in that way, optimize productivity.
I love it. I love it. You so seamlessly keep circling us back to the human part of human factors. And I just so much appreciate that about sitting here and getting to learn from you. You just described something that's been in recent fascination for me. I'm going to coin the phrase circadian science. So we're learning so much in recent years about circadian rhythms, as you're describing, about how core temperature crests and troughs on a sinusoidal wave, and how, like, as you said, hormones do the same things. And so all of these overlapping factors, as you describe, how you'll have mental acuity at certain times on that circadian cycle, and you'll have physical acuity at other times. And it's so encouraging to remind ourselves that, to coin your phrase, we're not robots. We're not just something that turns out. We have to take those things into account, and then I guess ultimately learn to maximize it. Is that safe to say? I mean, maximize it in a way that's best for all involved.
If by maximize you mean optimize.
Optimize, thank you.
Yes. I mean, because maximize tends to suggest doing something, really fast. So if I ask you to run as fast as you can, you can maximize it, but not for very long.
Right. Good point.
A Usain Bolt who can run, 100 meters in less than 10 seconds, put him in a Boston Marathon, he's not going to win. Yeah. So pacing becomes really, really important as well. Now, I like to sort of put a bit of an historical context on some of this as well, which, as you know, is a part of my sort of background. So the concept of fatigue goes, in its modern form, goes back to the end of World War I, where in the UK, they set up the British Industrial Fatigue Research Board.
Really?
Because what happened in World War I, well, let's think back to how people used to travel the world, right? If you were, a Sir Francis Drake, or if you were Ferdinand Magellan, or whoever it was, right? Christopher Columbus. Boy, you move through time zones really slowly.
That's right.
Right. And so your body had time to adjust to the different time zones. Now, of course, if you get on a plane in Paris, you're in New York in 8 or 9 hours, maybe less. And your body now can experience jet lag, which means your body is out of synchrony with the environment. As transport got faster, so some of these phenomena started to occur, and people began to realize, what is going on here? I felt okay when I left, and now that I've arrived, I'm not quite so sure I'm that okay. So in World War I, now you had the start of some faster modes of transport, the first use of fairly primitive airplanes, but still planes that could only fly in the day because you couldn't see at night time, right? But now you were going much faster than anything had ever gone before. You were not going at the speed of horseback, or, there was a prevailing view in the in the early days of railroads, that if you went more than 30 miles an hour, the human body would fall to pieces, right? Now you are flying at 70, 80, 90 miles an hour, whoa. So some of these phenomena started to have a real effect. The other thing was in World War I, now you had the mass use of munitions in a way that had never really happened before. And that meant running factories 24/7. So now you had people who were actually working day shifts and then night shifts as well. And people began to notice that, hey, more mistakes got made on the night shift than in the day shift. And so the British Industrial Fatigue Research Board was set up to figure out what on earth is going on. And I just want to show you this. This is one of the things that they found. Let me try and get this right. This is looking over the course of a year at the output from a factory. And what you can see is that early and this is in the UK, where summers are not extraordinarily hot, but certainly are hotter and there's more daylight. What you can see is that in the summer months, in fact, that's July and August, factory output was at its lowest. And it peaked in the winter months, right? And this was found time and time again. And that was the start of introducing the summer holidays. Factories would close down so you could do maintenance work and everything in the summer because productivity levels were lowest there and error rates were highest. Now, there are a whole variety of reasons why that might be. And part of it might be you're in a factory and it's nice and sunny outside. You want to go outside and have a good time, right? Part of it might be that. But also, part of it might relate back to other factors. And in this particular instance, one of the factors was light level. One of the factors was the effects of shift work. One of the factors was the temperature conditions. And we're not going to get into all the environmental thing, but that was the start of seriously looking at fatigue and how fatigue could affect performance. And this is in terms of physical output of munitions, right? And the last thing you wanted was people actually making a mistake there and blowing a factory up. And then people began to look at, wait a minute, the same holds true for cognitive performance, right? There are going to be certain times of the day when your brain is much sharper than other times of the day. Right. There are going to be certain times of the day when, if you're a surgeon, your operation is going to go much smoother than other times of the day, right? And especially if you've been doing a lot of operations and now you're really fatigued, you'll start to make more mistakes. So there's this trade-off between how often you do something, how long you do it, how fast you do it, what you use to do it, and what time of day you do it. Now, where does posture come into all of this? Well, remember I said that muscle activity, which is what guides our overt behavior. I'm not talking now about cognitive issues, but our overt behavior, doing things with our hands and feet or other parts of the body. That has to be done at a certain pace, and that pace is going to vary over time. And that depends also on the posture. So you can think of the body as being a collection of fairly rigid structures, bones, that are really held together through muscles attaching to them and pulling on them. I'm not getting into all the ligaments at joints here. But how you do things varies enormously, the effect that you have. So I want to give you a couple of quick examples. I'm going to temporarily share my screen here.
Please.
If it works. Let me see. I'm going to share I'll do my entire screen. Share that. Share audio. Okay. Share this. You should be able to see my screen now, hopefully.
Yes.
So let's think of something very simple and how this relates to what's becoming a major issue in our current population. So think about your head. Your head typically weighs about 10 to 12 pounds in an adult, right? Assuming you're not dangling anything off it or wearing a heavy helmet or anything like that. And this is kind of important because if you're in the military, putting a heavy helmet on this, or you're playing football, put a helmet on, changes these dynamics as well.
Correct.
So providing your head is nicely balanced over your spine, over the cervical vertebrae there, it's held in place by 4 groups of muscles. And I'm not going to get into the details of this, just to say that this is the most neutral posture. So if you can do work with your head straight in this position, not twisted, not bent to the side or anything, that's the optimal way of working. And if I asked you to read something in this position, you could probably sit or stand for a long period of time and read that and not experience any negative effects of that, right? Of course, there would be limits if you're not moving because muscles need blood supply. So movement helps to move the muscles, which helps to get blood circulating through muscles. So movement becomes important. But this is the most neutral posture. So when you look at our posture targeting methods like Ruler and Reba, this is what they're based on. The neutral posture. And this is just for the head and the neck. Now, what happens when you start working on something like a laptop on a desk? Right. Well, now you're looking down at about a 15-degree angle. That now effectively triples the weight of your head relative to the musculature that's trying to hold your head in place. So 1 hour of that is 3 times more fatiguing than 1 hour in a neutral position. Right. And so people have, gone away often from desktops to laptops or looking at displays like this, maybe looking in a car, looking down at where the speedometer is. That gets very fatiguing. Now it gets even worse if you work like this, right? Because now you're looking down at about a 30-degree angle. That's now increased the loading by about 4 times compared to neutral posture. You see people doing this all the time, wandering around with their phones like this, right?
That's right.
We're now dealing with a lot of issues that are related to this way of using the phone because now you've increased the loading on the musculature 5 times compared to a neutral posture. And if you hold your phone way down so you're almost looking at your feet, you now have effectively increased the weight that the muscles have to deal with by 6 times. That's huge, right?
Yeah.
That's huge. So 1 hour working in this 60-degree tilt is 6 times more fatiguing than 1 hour working in a neutral posture. So think of that. If somebody's on a production line and what they're actually doing on that production line is looking down as opposed to looking straight ahead, right? You can now see me, not that screen. Can you, Matt? Just
That's
checking.
correct. This
is not an interface I'm super used to. You can now see the importance of posture. And this is posture in terms of neck posture. Now, I want to do another little demo here, if that's okay with you.
Yes, please.
To look at different bits of the body. Okay? By the way, for neck posture, if you're really not sure, just take blocks like this and see at what point does that fall to pieces? And now you realize your head would fall off were it not for those 4 groups of muscles working really hard. So, be super careful. So I'm going to connect myself up here with some electrodes. Hopefully this will prove to be okay. All right. If suddenly I stop, I'll have connected things the wrong way around and it'll be a shocking experience. But what I want to show you, so what I've done, if you look here, is I've put some electrodes on muscles that actually control the position of my hand.
Correct.
And I want to start by looking at my hand moving side to side, okay? Now, I'm turning it into sound.
Yes.
So if I suddenly go like this, you can now see what a neutral posture is.
Love it.
How often do you see people who are using their hands like this on something, doing exactly the same work, but much greater risk of injury? So that's why when we do things like looking at hand posture, we're looking at lateral movements into ulnar deviation or radial deviation, right? And that's important not just for muscle activity, but it's important for the forces acting on the tendons that are going through the carpal tunnel and the forces acting on the median nerve in the carpal tunnel. But wait, there's even more, right? Now let's go this way Now I'm in neutral posture. And now let me do this, right?
Yes.
Whoa.
Yes.
Now notice as I come down, I have to get fairly steeply inclined as the sound goes up. That's because I'm pulling down on structures against the soft underbelly of the carpal tunnel, right?
Correct.
Which is a ligament. But the roof of the carpal tunnel is bone. So look what happens when I go this way.
Wow.
So now think of this. Your job all day is working on a keyboard and you're typing like this.
That's right. Yes.
As opposed to working like this, right?
That's
so
right.
You don't have to be a rocket scientist to realize that the same hour of work is going to be much, much more fatiguing there.
And yet, they still outfit keyboards with those little kickstand, putting us into the extended position. Isn't that odd?
Well, no. They do that for one really good reason.
What's that?
The risk of being sued. If they took those off and said these were a problem, then there would be a class action lawsuit against computer manufacturers saying you've caused all these injuries. Right?
Of course.
Of course.
Of course.
Don't forget our dear lawyers who just love it.
That's right. Oh,
but goodness. Then so this is one reason that when we look at people doing manual work, we look at the position of the hands.
Yes.
And we use posture targeting tools to look at that, because that doing the same work in a poor posture is much more injurious than doing it in a good posture. Right. And so again, we have to coach people to get them into good postures. Also, it's much more fatiguing because you heard how hard the muscles are having to work now compared to being in a neutral posture. Right. So this is the head and the neck. This is the hand and the arms. One more thing I want to look at, the back.
Please.
Okay. And I'm going to share screen again to try and show you this. Now, I have not rigged myself up to measure what happens with my back, right? But I have a little friend. Can you see Woody the lifter here?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so Woody was my little friend when I was at Cornell that I used to show students safe ways of lifting. So Woody is a little bit different to you and I because Woody doesn't have a full spine. Woody only has a lumbar vertebrae and a supersized coccyx that I can grab hold of. And so here you can see the lumbar vertebrae, the 5 lumbar vertebrae, and the intervertebral discs. Now, when you look at how Woody lifts something, look at this. I hope you can see my mouse here. Look at this.
Yes.
What's happening now? The load is too far away from the body. Yes. Look what happens now to that intervertebral disc as Woody lifts this, and then look at what happens as it snaps into place here. Boom. So if you're lifting things like this all day long, even if it's a so-called safe load, you're risking a back injury, right? Now, let's look at what happens if Woody does what we recommend, which is take the same load, try and pull the load closer to the body, sort of in between the legs, and now do a straight lift. Look again.
Yep. No snapping.
So, no snapping, no bent, no loading. I mean, you're getting the loading of the weight, but no other loading.
Yes.
So always bringing a load near to the body, lifting, especially with the legs and a straight back. That's what weightlifters do, right?
Right.
That's what and so these things are kind of really important. How you do work, the posture you're in to do work is critical to whether that work will increase or decrease the risk of an injury. And that's again why posture targeting techniques are so important. People often say, all you're doing is looking at where bits of the body are. How could that possibly relate to risk? It relates because where bits of the body are tells you how those bits are going to work over time when you repeat that movement over time.
Yes.
And hence our risk assessments are all based on these ideas of trying to get people into neutral postures as much as possible, as often as possible, and as long as possible. And even in a neutral posture, you need to have rest breaks because you will get fatigue.
Right.
So talking of rest breaks, it's my turn now to have a verbal rest break.
There you go.
And you to ask more questions.
No, beautiful. I appreciate that. And yes, you're, I can let you riff all day long. It's easy on me, but it's tougher on you, but it's better for our audience. They don't need to hear my problems. All kidding aside. I do appreciate the, biomechanics, that you've shared with us. And I always kind of drag us back, and forgive me for doing so. Part of it is just to give the employer's perspective on what they're saving in helping people do things right. But also part of me is I've always been a little bit of a lean continuous improvement geek. So I tend to look at things through the different wastes, as they say, the 8 different wastes, the downtime acronym. And I see, as you're describing that and showing Woody lifting, all of these different wastes cascading, and finally, till we have a lost time injury, of course. But there's also, from the employer's perspective, the issue of when people work to that point, you wind up with what we talk about in lean all the time. One of the wastes is defects. And once you have defects, you've got to redo work. So it stands to reason, benefiting all elements of this equation, that we get things right and we promote doing things right, as you demonstrated with Woody. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely, yeah, that is fair to say. The one other aspect that relates to that is, and I want to come back to this concept of the ergonomist as a coach, is technique.
Yes.
And that is that, think of a child learning to write letters of the alphabet, of our English alphabet. The first time they write them, they're not really great, and it's a lot of effort to do that. But by the time you are an adult, writing those is a trivial task. Right? And it doesn't take a lot of time, and they look so much better. They're much easier to do. So what companies need to think about is not just looking at the job and the cycle times and the down times and maybe the defects there as they are at the moment, but how to build skill. So skill will reduce all of those factors. It reminds me of, when I was a student, one of the jobs I did was working in a metal tube factory as an inspector. And my job was to inspect the outside and the inside of these tubes that were about 15 feet long and sort of large diameter, to see if there were any defects in the rolling process. And then I had to flag those defects with chalk that lit up under ultraviolet light. And I thought I did a pretty good job. Except at the end of the first shift, a really experienced inspector looked at everything I did and said, "Who did this? You missed like half of the defects there. You got all the big stuff, but you missed all the little stuff." Mm-hmm. Right? Because I wasn't skilled. So it really means when a company is looking to implement an ergonomics program, they have to look at how does the most skilled employee do this job. They may not do it the fastest, but they may do it the best, with the fewest defects, right? Speed, yes. In many aspects of human performance, there's what we call a speed-error trade-off, right? You do something quickly, but you tend to tolerate higher levels of errors.
Right.
Whereas what we want to do is optimize that. And if what is important to you is the quality of the product, then what you want to focus on is how do we minimize defects? And that might mean changing the speed with which things are done and the skill level that's applied to that. On the other hand, if all you're doing is you're at a supermarket checkout and you're just swiping objects past you, right? There's not really there a defect issue. It's more a speed issue. So companies need to figure out what job are we in. If I'm Rolex, for example, I don't want to make watches as fast as possible.
Right.
I want to make watches as well as possible because that's the value of them. These are works of art and they don't produce millions every year.
No.
On the other hand, if I'm another company who just wants to do a cheapo digital watch,
Right.
they can make millions of them a year and not worry about the quality so much, right? So companies need to figure that out before just calling in the ergonomist to solve the problems. The problems are not just that somebody's deliberately injuring themselves. Looking at how they're working, looking at their posture is helping assess the risk of injury. But it's not the only thing. A good sports coach is not just looking at what a player does, but they're looking at how a player does that. And often what they're adjusting is the technique that the player is using. And learning a new technique over time takes time.
Yes.
Right? And again, that often gets lost in ergonomics because what we're really trying to do is improve all aspects of the quality of the work that's done. And at the end of the day, somebody who does really great work probably feels really good about their performance. Right?
True.
Whereas somebody who just does stuff, I can't be bothered, I'm just going to flip these burgers or whatever it is, probably doesn't feel that fulfilled at the end of the day.
That makes sense. Is there any risk-benefit analysis when it comes to perhaps trying to incentivize these behaviors? When we look at postures and fatigue and defects, if we were to pursue, as we described, the near miss and try and get people incentivized, I'm sure there's a risk-benefit analysis in there somewhere. With the moments we have remaining, could you share maybe some of that perspective?
Well, there are multiple risk benefits. Right? Let's start with the simplest one. That is the posture you're working in. Right. We all have one enormous, huge disadvantage as biological organisms. Our eyes are inside our head. We can't see how we're working. Right? Right. We really can't. And so often somebody will say, oh, no, I can lift this box. It's perfectly safely. And you say, do you know how you're doing that? Oh, I've done this. No, 80% of people are going to get a back injury, right? If they could see how they were working, how they were doing things, it wouldn't be that large a number. And again, that's part of the value of an ergonomist or a technology like having a video showing this is how you do things. And I keep coming back to coaching, to sports coaching, because what do? They take a video of how you hit the golf ball, then they slow it down and they analyze frame by frame. This is where you're going wrong. This is the bit you need to change. This is how you improve. We need to do that with ergonomics. Just incentivizing somebody and saying, hey, I'm going to pay you, I'm going to give you an extra 1% for every day you don't complain about a back problem. Yes. No, that's yes. You mentioned this before, right? Yes. About, having the days since we had an accident and how that actually is not really an incentive.
No.
Often praise is a great incentive to be able to say to somebody, you did a really great job. This was a superb piece of work that you did. But remember, doing something superbly, you may not be able to repeat that performance as well the next time around. For example, if you're an artist, you don't want to be able to paint the same image a million times. So let me give an example there of what I mean. I did a project once with a biscuit factory, a cookies factory.
Right.
Where people were manually stacking cookies, putting cookies into these tin selection boxes. Right, and they each have little compartments. And so their job was to pick up a handful of cookies and to put it into a compartment in the box. And the company had said, we have introduced job rotation to try and reduce the injuries that people have. Great.
Right.
So what that meant, there were, I know, 20 people on the line or something. And after 30 minutes, a sound would go off and people would rotate. And you would get the start of the day. Okay, today you're doing, 1, 5, 10, 15, whatever. The injuries didn't go down. I said, what's going on? Job rotation supposed to reduce in blah, 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 blah. So I looked at what they were doing and I realized that, in fact, you were moving from picking cookies up like this and putting them in position 1 to doing exactly the same movement in position 5. It was a different cookie, right? But it was the same posture. It was the same movement. So unless you're varying how things are done and which bits of the body are doing those things, you're not really rotating the job in terms of how the body is dealing with those injuries. So that's something else that companies need to think about. You have to be able to look at what people are doing, how they're doing it, how often they do it, how much rest and recovery time they need. Look at a sprinter. I mean, somebody who sprints 100 meters in the Olympics, how long do they have to recover? I mean, they collapse in a pile of exhaustion after that. You did this in 10 seconds and you're exhausted. I mean, How could that possibly be? No, so we need to make sure companies realize we have so much more to offer as ergonomists than just saying, oh, yes, here's the NIOSH lifting equation, adhere to this and life will be great. And this, again, is why tools like being able to do posture analysis really quickly and to compare somebody who's at the beginning, i.e. they're a novice on the job, to somebody who is semi-skilled, to somebody who is totally skilled, now you can see the difference in performance. You see this with a musician. Look at somebody who starts to learn the piano. Maybe they can play, but not very good. And then what is a semi-skilled pianist? And then what's a concert pianist? I mean, that's the pinnacle of skill. And they make it seem effortless.
Yes.
Right. And the reason they do that is that it's not just your body that's doing it. It's your brain as well. The brain has to talk to the muscles and tell them what to do. And the brain anticipates that. So a concert pianist is not thinking, I need to press my index finger on this key. Their brain's way ahead of that. The motor programs are in there and it just comes out in a fluid way. So skilled workers work in what seems to be a sort of effortless way, and they don't tend to get injured. So again, I come back to the thing I talked about in the very first podcast we did. Skill is critical to the quality of work. And skill depends on things like posture. It depends on the load you're doing. It depends on the pace that you're working. It depends on how you're doing that work. And in part, it depends on the pride you can take in the product that comes out at the end of the day.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much again, Dr. Allen. Dr. Hedge, I could listen all afternoon, and I think we need to do more of these if you're willing. Would you come back for more discussion on these topics?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'd love to expand more on things. Yes.
Brilliant. Well, let's plan on that. We'll keep turning these out for Tamiki podcasts and the ergonomics community and beyond, because again, as I learned from listening to you, human factors is just ever encompassing. I describe it as lifestyle medicine. I know you're not crazy about that label, but I just see where it affects so many aspects of our life. And you bring that to this discussion, reminding us that we're not all angles. We're not all, Euclidean geometry. We're living human beings. And the more we know about ourselves, the better we can function and have happy, productive lives. Is that safe to say?
Absolutely.
Excellent. Well, Dr. Hedge, looking forward to our next time together. And so for you and for myself, Matt Jeffs, I want to say again, folks, thanks again for listening to the Tamiki Ergonomics podcast. We will see you next time. Until that time, take care, everybody. Bye-bye. We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Tamiki Ergonomics podcast with Professor Emeritus in Human-Centered Design at Cornell University, Dr. Alan Hedge. Remember, click the notification bell to keep up with the best in ergonomics knowledge sharing, and feel free to leave a comment below. We do read your comments. Also, be sure to subscribe and share this and future episodes with colleagues and clients who can benefit from this valuable information. On behalf of the Tamiki Ergonomics podcast, I'm Matt Jeffs, and remember, work smarter, not harder. See you next time, everybody.